I'm here with G. Edward Griffin, most famous for authoring The Beast from Jekyll Island. Hello, Mr. Griffin. I really appreciate you coming on.
Well, thank you. Thanks.
I know your time's short, so I kind of wanted to get to the nuts and bolts of what you're most famous for. The Beast from Jekyll Island. It's about the Federal Reserve. Can you kind of, summarize what your book was about and what the thesis of? I mean, I've read it, but for those at home.
Summarize it, okay.
In so many words.
It's a huge topic, of course, but you can condense it down. I'll start by summarizing what it is not, okay? It is not what most people think it is. Most people, as I did at one time, thought that the Federal Reserve was an agency of the federal government and that it was obedient to the will of the people indirectly through their elected representatives. And it was sold back in 1913, sold to Congress to pass it because they thought it was a means of controlling the big bad banks. There was a lot of concern back in those days about corruption in the banking system, monopoly of the money supply, controlling industry and credit through the banks, and unfairly manipulating and literally plundering people. So there was this popular pressure in those days to pass a law. Everybody thinks that if we just pass a law, this will solve it, So the idea was pass a law to control the big bad banks. That was the Federal Reserve Act. Well, it turns out that the law was written by the bankers. And that's why I called my book The Creature from Jekyll Island, because they wrote the law on Jekyll Island, which is a real island off the coast of Georgia. And they had a secret meeting there, which is well documented by them, by the way. It's not something you just invent in your mind. It's all in the record. I spent some time on Jekyll Island digging into their historical records and photographs and memoirs, all that stuff. This is real. They had a secret meeting in Jekyll Island where they created what we properly should call this thing a cartel, a banking cartel. And they decided that since the American people were demanding some legislation to control the banks said, well, why should we allow that to happen? Let us write the legislation and let them think that it's doing what they think it's going to. Let us control our own industry, and we'll set the rules to our liking, and we'll make it look like it's a government agency, and we'll make it look like these rules are really protecting the interests of the people, but in reality we have our fingers on all the keys on the keyboard, so it favors us and not what people thought. So I start with that because people think it's a federal agency, and it's not. So what is it? I already mentioned it. It's a cartel. It's no different than a banking cartel or a banana cartel, oil cartel. No different than an oil cartel or a peanut cartel. It is a banking cartel, I should have said. And once people understand that, then things begin to clear up, because we first should ask, well, what's the purpose of a cartel? Regardless of what it says it is, a cartel has only one purpose, and that's to promote the interests of the members of the cartel. Period. Close the door on that. That's its whole purpose. But since the banking cartel has to appear in order to gain popular support and passive acceptance, has to appear as though it's serving the people. They can't come out and say, well, we're a cartel and we're serving the interests of the banks. They have to say, well, we're doing things for you folks, So the chairman of the Fed comes before a congressional meeting, a committee meeting, and they ask him questions. And it looks like the Congress is in charge, because the congressmen are sitting up there at the table with all these big leather chairs, and the chairman is sitting down at the low table with a little microphone, and he's looking up at the people at the dais there. So it looks like Congress is in charge. They're asking him questions, and he's answering questions. But in reality, he doesn't have to answer any questions if he doesn't want to. And those that he does, and by the way, sometimes you'll hear the chairman say, well, I'm not going to answer that. And they just say, oh, okay, and they move along, because they know they have no power over the Federal Reserve. It's an entity above Congress. So, and then they say, well, why did you raise interest rates last year? And the chairman will probably say, well, we raised interest rates because we wanted to control inflation for you folks. It was all for you folks. They would never say, well, we raised interest rates because it earns more money for us and we think we can get away with it, and it increases our profits. No, it's for you folks that we did it. Well, why did you lower the interest rates? Well, we want to stimulate employment. And they'll never say, well, we lowered the interest rates in order to encourage greater government debt and corporate debt because at lower interest rates they'll borrow more money. And we make money from interest on loans, and so we wanted to stimulate loans. That's why we did it, so we could make more money. They would never say that. They said, well, we lowered interest rates. Well, because we wanted to stimulate the economy. We wanted to improve the living conditions of people. This is how it works. And once you understand, if you go back to that meeting on Jekyll Island, as I did in my book, and study the papers of the people who were there, and the motivations and what they said and what they've done, at last you have the ability to understand what it is, and it's not too complicated. When you see some big crisis comes along and Congress gets together and let's say the banks are going bankrupt. The banks go bankrupt because they've made bad loans, knowing that Congress is going to bail them out, going to give them taxpayer money. Any other business goes bankrupt, they go bankrupt, but not the banks. They come back and say, oh, America will fall if the banks fall, and so they say, give us some money, give us a bailout, $1 billion or $1 trillion in bailout, and they say, well, we'll do it in order to save America. And so they go in and they get all this money from the taxpayers, and yeah, industry goes kaput, people lose their houses, they lose their jobs, prices go up, but the banks always come out really good on this. And how did that happen? They've made a mistake somewhere. No, they didn't make a mistake. This is how it was designed to be, to always create a system of the banks, for the banks, and by the banks.
You said that if you look into the records of that meeting, you can see the actual motivations of the bankers that drafted it. Do you mean there were like actual minutes taken and transcriptions of the meetings, or what do you mean by that specifically?
No, there were no minutes that I'm aware of, but most of the men that were there were 6 of them. Most of them had memoirs. And they not only spoke about what they did, but they spoke about the reasoning for having the meeting, and those are in their memoirs. The larger names have historians. They've written their biographies. Their children and grandchildren and their relatives have spoken in interviews. Many of them have had newspaper interviews, and these were printed in the day, and you can find them in the microfilm. And so it's in the record, but not minutes of the meeting, And it's very clear. In fact, one of these names are kind of foggy on me right now. I need some sleep, but I'll come back to his name anyway. He wrote an article in the New York Times. This was years after the foundation of the Fed. He described the meeting in great detail, the secrecy of how they got on board the private railroad car of Senator Nelson Aldrich, for example. It was a private railroad car, and they told the people the 6 men that were there, when they addressed each other, not to use their last names when talking to each other in this private railroad car, first names only. And 2 of them even abandoned their first names and used code names. And I thought to myself, well, why would they do that in the privacy of this car? And this fellow answers the question in the article. And later he wrote a book about it too, and he answers it again in the book. And he says it's because they knew that there were servants on board the train, that, of course, they knew who Aldrich was, but they didn't know who these people were. And if the servants were to talk, oh, did you know that so-and-so was there? And that the word would get out, and the whole secrecy, the purpose of the meeting would possibly be disrupted. So that's what I mean by their records in their words. It's not something coming from their opponents or their critics.
Now, if the Federal Reserve is not accountable to the United States government, who are they accountable? Who is actually benefiting, and who is calling the shots for these what are they, governors? I guess regional governors. Is that what that's
correct?
Runs them, right?
Yeah, it's like any cartel. Who runs the cartel? Well, it depends on the cartel, but it's always the largest, most powerful members of the cartel. They carry the most weight, because if they try to pull out of the cartel or just say, I'm not going to be part of it anymore, then it collapses or it loses its effectiveness, at least. So the larger members, the most powerful members of any cartel are the ones that call the shots. And in this case, the Federal Reserve means it's the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. That's the most powerful of them. And they're the tail that wags the dog. Now, as far as the selection of the chairman of the Fed, who we think is the most powerful man in the world because he's the chairman of the Fed, no, it's not. That doesn't work that way. Now, he's appointed by the president, So people will say, aha, the president selects the chairman. So therefore, you see, we do have a voice in control. But if you look at the chairman of the Fed, ever since it was created, I don't know of any case where the president actually knew the person that they appointed before they appointed them. So where did they get the idea they're going to appoint so-and-so? It's not in their phone book, so it came from somebody else's phone book, right? Well, it comes from the donors to his campaign, the big donors, the banks, in other words, and the corporations which the banks control that put the money into the political campaigns that allow them to be president. So, of course, I've never been privy to a meeting, but I'm sure it goes something like this. It's, well, Mr. Smith, I'm the president of Chase Manhattan, or I am Henry Kissinger, or whatever, and I represent the Rockefeller interests, as you know, and we have been studying you as a campaigner for the presidency, and we like you. Now, we don't agree with everything that you are for, but we think you're a good man, and we would be willing to help you get elected. In fact, as you know, we can get you elected because we can control the media and we can get you a lot of money. And all we would ask in return is that when it comes time to appoint the Supreme Court or the Chairman of the Federal Reserve or Secretary of State or any of the other appointments, that you would consider our recommendation. And everybody knows that if they say no, they don't get the endorsement, they don't get the money. So the candidate goes in with a commitment. And he's elected president, and now it's time to make appointments. And I am not aware of any exceptions to this, even though it may appear to be that somebody being appointed is on the record, he might be opposed. There is nobody ever appointed to the chairman of the Federal Reserve who is not a banker or comes from a banking family or has huge financial investments in the large Wall Street firms. Every one of them. The idea of a chairman of the Federal Reserve coming from a group like ours here where we have questions or criticisms of the Fed, not a chance. So the idea that because the president appoints the chairman, therefore the voters and the public somehow have some influence over it is a myth.
Well, what would you say to those who may agree that, the Federal Reserve is obviously this shadowy, unaccountable organization with huge influence on our economy, but it serves a purpose in that it prevents the markets from these large boom and bust cycles that supposedly characterize the economy pre-1913. That's the standard argument.
I would love to have that argument posed, or that question posed to me, because I could, with the documents I have in my book, prove that it's just the opposite. That it's control of the money system by the Federal Reserve that creates the boom-bust cycle. And these happened before the Federal Reserve, but there were institutions exactly like the Federal Reserve at the state level. The states all had their own little Federal Reserves, and it was the control of the monetary system, the expansion and contraction of the money supply at will, that causes booms and busts. You take that away, and booms and busts become almost impossible. So the answer is that it's just the opposite.
Thank you. I really think that's the end. Other than that, I really want to plug the Red Pill Expo that you're going to be speaking at on June 7th and 9th. It's going to be in Hartford, Connecticut.
Yes.
Yes. Everyone who's watching should come check it out. TSOA is going to be there. We're setting up a media tent just like we have here.
Yeah, well, we talk about the red pill.
Right.
The Federal Reserve is just one huge red pill, but there are a lot more out there. So the idea at the Red Pill Expo is to bring people in. We may think these ideas are crazy. I have to tell you, the first time I heard that the Federal Reserve wasn't a government agency, I thought the guy that told me that was nuts. It's impossible.
Right.
And my views on health, for example, now compared to what I thought when I was a young man, I would have thought what I believe now is nuts then. So I have learned that you can't close your mind too quickly. You should examine things, you should question them, be skeptical, but don't close your mind to them.
Well, Mr. Griffin, I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And hopefully you could red pill us again later.
I'd love to do that.
Take care. Oh, and by the way, hopefully maybe you'll be able to come to our conference we're having in Philadelphia. It's called Anarchadelphia. It's in September 14th to 16th. We're in contact with your assistant. Maybe you could red pill some people in Philly too.
Okay, let's find out what you're all about, and I'd be glad to think about that. Sounds to me like you're on the right track.
Take care. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Join the State of Anarchy this September's Harvest Moon in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where this gathering of like minds aims to foster unbreakable relationships between the movement's leading forces, whom teach self-love and ownership, blockchain techno-economics, as well as exposing the Earth's sacred hidden knowledge. So will we see you there?